Before last year, a year where we faced an event that gave us a nearly infinite amount of time at home, there were two common thoughts that I would have regarding tabletop gaming. The first being that solo board gaming was this strange thing I never really wanted to try. Board gaming for me was about sitting around friends and having a laugh and enjoying a game. And managing all the bits and bobs and tokens is not really something I wanted to do on my own. The second thing was that app-driven games were a weird offshoot that probably wouldn't really take off, and it's not something that I would want to try because board gaming was this tactile thing, something that you needed to feel and experience in a way that apps wouldn't let you necessarily do. Well, in the words of the great philosopher Maurice Moss,
egg and my face were in alignment.
If you knew me when I was saying these things, you may have been able to save me some embarrassment. I have been a big video game fan for a couple of decades now. And without a doubt, app-driven and solo board gaming have made this hobby have a bit more in common with digital games.
this game right here gave me one of my favorite experiences ever. So it's high time we talk about Journeys in Middle-earth.
In many ways, Journeys in Middle-earth couldn't fail. It was another project by the behemoth that is Fantasy Flight Games, a highly successful company known for their quality products. The IP was nearly universally beloved already, as it was to take place in Tolkien's world, and lastly, it was taking a new idea in app-driven narrative tabletop gaming and perfecting it after the success that was Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition and Descent's digital companion app. For me, however, most of these things were new. I had only dabbled in FFG products at the time of its release, and I wasn't really interested in app-driven experiences, as I mentioned at the top of the video, especially one that was mandatory to play the game. When I saw the first photos of Journeys in Middle-earth, however, I couldn't shake it. I was immediately drawn into the world of Middle-earth that I loved so dearly again, and knew I wanted to try it. I was a young teenager when Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring was released, and it blew me away. Now, I had been exposed to fantasy before, Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, for example, but this was the first time I had seen anything with the epic scope of world building and lore, battle and stakes that The Lord of the Rings has. I was hooked. I read all 3 of the novels before the Two Towers film came out the following Christmas. I spent hours reading about lore, legends, and geography online, and I bugged my friends with details that I thought were awesome.
Now, why do I tell you all this? Well, because in the deepest recesses of the pit that was 2020, this one game created an incredible campaign of escapism, using mechanics that I didn't know I wanted to help me revisit a world I didn't realize I so dearly missed.
With that being said, let's dive deeper into Journeys in Middle-earth and explain a little bit of how the game itself works. At its core, Journeys in Middle-earth is a deck-building game, mixed with some exploration and some light role-playing elements. Instead of building a deck over the course of a play session, however, you will do so in between sessions, learning new skills and actions as you rest between story beats and individual scenarios. A lot of campaign games do this, and I think there's a good reason for it. It gives you a sense of progression. It's a role-playing game. You're spending several hours in the shoes of a fantasy hero. You want that feeling for this type of game. You want to feel like you're getting somewhere. You, as a player, take a journey through the story, and your characters take a journey through progression into a heroic or killing machine, or maybe just a better singer. The deck-building genre has hit its zenith at this point in tabletop gaming's life, and perhaps it's past its heyday, but it really adds to this game. One thing that I think makes it work here is that you start with a decent-sized deck of cards to begin with, and one that contains a larger number of cards than your average deck builder. So there's more to learn here from the get-go, which I think helps make the experience better. When you start the game, you're going to pick a number of heroes to begin with. You have some familiar faces here: Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Bilbo if you're in the mood to play a hobbit, and some of Fantasy Flight's own creations. As a side note, I recently got a copy of Fantasy Flight's older Lord of the Rings themed game, Middle-earth Quest. Some of these original characters show up here, as well as the widely supported LCG from the company. think it's admirable that the company has supported their own extended canon for so long, and even if you're more of a Tolkien purist, it's nice to see a company stick to their own mythology. I should also note that there are more characters up for grabs if you have the Shadowed Paths expansion and the Spreading War expansion that's coming later. We'll add more, I'm sure. Shadowed Paths adds a certain wizard I was more than excited to try, but more on the expansion later. As I mentioned, you build a deck for your chosen characters before even opening the app based on the suggested roles, and at that point you're ready to dive in. I like that for a fairly lengthy game, you have a relatively quick start. You get out all the components, build your deck, and then you're pretty much ready. The app tells you how to build the map as you go, so no need to put together a large section beforehand. Each character starts with the same set of basic cards based on the role chosen for your character, and some specific cards to that hero. They also get the dreaded weakness, which I find quite comical in some cases and even oddly thematic. Journeys in Middle-earth has this clever two-pronged approach in its design. A deck builder typically focuses on a deck of cards, but that's not where you really start on your turn. Yes, you draw a couple of cards at the beginning of a new round and decide which to prepare, but at the start of a hero's actual turn in the round, they pick 2 actions to take. So, the deck of cards kind of illustrate the actions instead of driving them. The 3 possible actions a hero can take on their turn are travel, interact, and, stab things. You can double up on an action, or mix it up like that flexible adventurer you are. As the map takes shape and the app populates that map with search tokens, threats, and enemies, you'll notice that each map tile is divided up into multiple spaces. When you take the travel action, you can move up to 2 of these spaces. If you choose to take the interact action, you'll need to be in a space with one of these tokens and then follow the encounter through on the app. If you take the combat action, you'll need to be in the same space as an enemy or next to one if you have a ranged weapon. More on the details of these actions later. But I just want to say I like this action system. It's simple. Those looking for a game with more depth might find this game lacking, but for me there's just enough variability to make it interesting. When you attack or interact with a search person or threat token, you'll need to test one of your attributes. Are you ready for a game mechanic deep dive? Well, ready or not, here we go. When you're attacking, you'll pick an enemy. Check one of your equipped weapons and a skill present on that item. Once you've done this, it's time to draw some cards. Each skill has a value associated with it. That's the number of cards you need to draw to test the attribute. When you draw these cards, you need to look out for a few things. This star symbol is a success. This is what you want to see. Each success gives you a number of things that you can do based on the item that you're using. Most of the time, these translate to hits of damage you deal or an attack type. When you're testing an attribute outside of combat, these serve as successes for the test. There is one other icon you can find on your cards in your deck, and that is this leaf icon, which represents fate. Throughout Journeys in Middle-earth, you'll receive inspiration from completing tests and exploration. These inspiration tokens can be spent during tests when you draw this icon. There's no limit to how many of these you can spend on a given test, but each character can only hold a certain amount at a given time. Thus ends the game mechanic deep dive. Once you get a grasp on the testing system, it really becomes second nature. As you might expect, as your deck changes, the probability of successes can increase, making it feel like a bit of a level up. And that's not the only similarity this game has to the RPG genre. Your skill cards can change and give you different abilities on your turn. Some of these abilities can only be triggered by discarding a card, but some also offer persistent effects. Lastly, cards in your deck include a bold text, which allow you to discard the card from another effect. Cards can be discarded for extra movement. Some cards allow you to guard another hero or yourself to prevent damage, and some can be used to rest, arguably giving you the chance to lick your wounds and have a bit of second breakfast.
We've already had it.
We've had one, yes.
I mentioned earlier that the roles your characters can play here are quite varied, and that points to a strength of Tolkien's world and its characters. There is adventure here, exploration, violence, and tragedy, but also stillness, quiet, and the finer things in life. Journeys in Middle-earth is heavily centered on those more action-oriented things, but does a nice job alluding to the other sides of Middle-earth's inhabitants. You can be a musician or a traveler. If you have the big box expansion, you can even be a blacksmith. One of the things I love about these varied roles is that if you take one of the more, let's say, occupational roles in the game, they won't be one of your most reliable damage dealers, but they do have the ability to deal it. This too points to Tolkien's characterization and points to a larger theme in this world, and that is doing what is necessary. A humble hobbit may rather be sitting at home enjoying the warmth of the hearth, but they will take up arms if the need arises. One interesting thing to note about these roles is that you can change the role of each character in between sessions. Now, this has always struck me as a bit strange, and it's not something I have wanted to try, partially because I really didn't want to have to add the different role cards, mix and match, but it's also because, I like the role play.
I will say, however, that there's some pretty interesting and even funny implications to changing roles mid-campaign. Let's take Aragorn, for example. It's suggested that he starts off as the captain, but maybe he's tired of being in charge. Maybe he wants to be the musician, sing for a little while. And if you've seen the extended editions of the films, or read the books even, that's actually on brand. That and someone else can grab the captain and reference that movie from a few years ago.
All of this can be managed in the app, and with that, it's probably time to talk about it, a digital game component that you can't actually play without. Look, here's the thing. If you aren't a fan of app-based games, this isn't really going to do it for you. You may have already made up your mind that this game isn't for you. But like I did, I fell in love with this game, not in spite of the app, but partially because of it. The app is really well done. It's not just some buttons and campaign tracking. There's attention to detail here that is really impressive. There's animation, there's thematic music, sound effects, and even some narration at the beginning. Okay, maybe I'm overselling it. There's only narration at the intro to each campaign arc, but Fantasy Flight could have phoned it in. They could have given you a spreadsheet, but the fact there is more of a professional audio and visual representation here tells you that they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to give you a book to read or a stack of cards to flip through. They made this more of a multimedia presentation. It's your pocket DM. I mentioned at the top of the video that I was never a fan of the idea of playing a board game by myself, but because of the app and Journeys in Middle-earth, I now love it. It's like a personal Dungeons & Dragons session without downtime you inevitably face when someone else is exploring a corner when they swear they know exactly what the DM is hiding in that waterfall. That's not a story from personal experience, though. Nope. Not at all. When you start a game of Journeys in Middle-earth, you'll pick characters and roles, making a party of up to however many characters you want, really. Standard solo play asks you to play with at least 2 characters, but you can use more if you want to. I've played with a duo of heroes, but as I got more comfortable with the game, I felt like I could add a third. This allows you to experience more of what the game has to offer. One nice thing about the app is that it will adjust difficulty for you. No need to keep track of that yourself. The app offers you a few difficulty levels, most of this variability being reflected in how much time you have to complete your objectives and how many enemies you'll face. I've played a few games on normal, but I've most enjoyed the game on adventure mode, which, as the app states, allows to explore more of what the world has to offer, seeing each and every corner, token, and test in this world. I'll tell you why I enjoy adventure mode so much. Yes, there's more challenge here if you want it, but the movies and the books that present Tolkien's creations in his world have always evoked a sense of heroism and competence, despite seemingly insurmountable odds. I've wanted to create that feeling when playing this game, as well as feeling out the thematic challenge and opportunity. This wouldn't be possible if you were trying to complete the game as fast as possible, which is what harder difficulties would have you do, because of the threat track. There are 2 types of games you'll be playing when you start a scenario in a campaign: a journey map and a battle map. The journeys are perhaps the more interesting of the 2, having you explore the countryside made up of these modular landscape tiles. The detail in these tiles is wonderful, although being a little bit small but purposely unique. When you reach a new map tile, the app will describe some of what you see and give you some instructions on how to interact with your newly explored territory. It has you lay out the appropriate search tokens, and it fills your future with possibility. A lot of these descriptions will be represented on the tiles they take place in. A lake with crystal clear water, a cave with dark corners and darker secrets, an elven village protected in the treetops. All of these are present on the tiles, and it's a nice detail. With modular tiles forming the landscape of an adventure, you never quite know how big or small and in what direction the map might turn. It adds a good bit of mystery to the game. One strange thing about not having a set board, however, is it can be a challenge to set up. You need a good-sized table to play the game with all of the components and all the space they take up. And if you have the map set up in a less than optimal place on your table, it can be difficult to change the location. Remember, in the books when Legolas wasn't there to help Frodo because he fell off the side of the planet? Just me? Okay. The other type of scenario you can face in Journeys in Middle-earth is a battle map. This setup is a lot more manageable in terms of table space, but way less impressive in terms of presentation. If it is so starkly different, that makes me wonder if there were obvious game-breaking glitches in having battle-centric scenarios on journey maps that they threw in these large squares of cardboard so they could confine you to them. There's some design effort here, and obstacles and elements are added to these maps to make you use the old noodle. These are anything from bushes to hide in at the end of your turn, walls and rivers that funnel you to different spaces, and statues and barrels you can use as weapons against the denizens of the Dark Lords. Stabface the Orc was afraid of the Flame of Arnor, sure, but it is lesser known that a stack of barrels, that was his ultimate bane. Better luck next time, orcs. I've never experienced feeling totally helpless in one of these particular encounters, but I have wondered how a Hobbit support character or even in the other support classes might deal with these scenarios. Most of the characters I've played in my campaign deal a good bit of damage, so I've felt like each one had something to do in these particular maps. I could see dreading these battle scenarios if you weren't much of a fighter, but then again, Fantasy Flight know what they're doing, and they may have had enough balance in the game for everyone to feel useful. I still can't help but feel a bit overwhelmed by these battle scenarios, though, since the visuals on these maps is so bland. I so enjoy the core gameplay loop, however, so it's never been enough to ruin a game for me. One subset of this particular game type that I want to mention, though, is the social setups. At times, and I believe this happens once a campaign, the game will have you in a situation that is on the battle maps, but it's purely social. One game has you exploring a murder in a tavern as if you're suddenly playing a game of Clue. Another, in an expansion, has you at an elven party trying to convince the elves to aid in the fight against the threat in Mirkwood. These scenarios are really creative and a welcome change of pace. The app does a lot here, and I found it a little difficult to keep all of the information balanced. I'm thankful for the Chronicle in that case to go back and look over all the clues given. Regardless of what type of game you're playing, the core mechanics stay the same. On journey maps and battle maps, you can move, interact, or fight, and the simplicity in these actions help you feel ready to face whatever comes your way in these varied scenarios. Regardless of which actions you take, the app is there to describe it for you. I mentioned earlier that the app is your game master, and there isn't a better example to explain what I mean than in test results. Are you trying to break open a chest? Depending on how many successes you draw in your deck, the app will describe to you how you mustered strength from within, or embarrassingly failed to open a simple lock. The writing is great here, being descriptive without being overly flowery or obtuse. It's simple enough to give you direction without holding your hand. Another thing I love about the app-driven experience is the upkeep of skills and gear. In between scenarios, you have the opportunity to change your deck by buying new skills with XP and leveling up your gear. It's all pretty self-explanatory and helpful to have it digitized. It streamlines the experience without making it feel cheap. The drive for new gear and XP is rewarded on the map, and I'll mention again, you have more time to find these things if you're in adventure mode. The more search tokens you find, the greater possibility for lore and XP scores to increase, making the following scenarios all the more interesting and enjoyable. There are a couple of other helpful things about the app as well. A log feature allows you to review what a token and character has said. This is especially helpful in those social scenarios, which I would imagine would be a nightmare without this feature. I'm looking at you, Destinies. Another welcome feature is the ability to save and quit. The app remembers your choices, and I've never had an awkward save or crash that loses my progress. Another nightmare scenario, I'd imagine. If you have an itchy trigger finger, the figures and tokens are all on the board already, so you have that to fall back on if you happen to lose your progress in the app. This is perhaps one downside to the app. It's the hand-holding that it does. Because combat especially is handled in the app, there's a less need to memorize all that the game has to offer. For example, the modifiers can be added to damage dealt. I still don't really know what they do, I just added and decided if it was worth it or not. If there isn't an app to hold my hand here, I probably would remember what the differences between cleave and lethal are, without hitting the button to remind myself. Monster modifiers fall into this category as well. What does Bloodthirsty do again? There's a lot more to love here, so I'll just go through a quick summary of some of the other things that are great about Journeys in Middle-earth. Last stand tests add to the tension of character elimination. This happens when someone has their fill of damage or fear. Damage, or fear damage. Do you hold on to inspiration in case you need it for a subsequent test? You don't know. There's a little bit of a gambling in that. Do you hold on to these resources or not? Titles can be earned based on narrative choices. Those are really awesome one-time use cards that feel really great to use, and they're really powerful. Trinkets can also be found in the world, and they're these awesome thematic cards that just I love. You can only hold one, so during your upkeep in between scenarios, you have to pick which one you want and give it to a certain character or not. They're great.
Okay, just a quick moment to interject to talk a little bit more about trinkets. They're too cool not to spend a little bit more time on. The first one I have here to mention is the Old Pipe, which allows you to prepare an additional card if there are no nearby enemies during the rally phase when you're scouting through your deck and preparing cards that you can possibly use for another day. I love this idea that perhaps you come across some old Tovey, and the moment of respite allows you to get just a little more prepared for what's coming in the turn ahead. Also, the Weather Torch is pretty cool because it lets you ignore darkness, which is an effect that can cause additional fear at the end of a turn. And you can deplete it to add Pierce or Smite, one of those modifiers that we talked about just a moment ago. It's as if Aragorn is on top of Amen Hen using that torch to throw into the hood of a ring wraith, causing extra damage.
In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes, "It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door." This was perhaps never more true in the modern world than this last year when we faced an unprecedented health threat. This game has created hours of enjoyment for me in a way I never expected, and I'd venture to say it's one of my favorite tabletop experiences ever. If I couldn't have a fellowship around me in real life, this high-quality narrative experience was the next best thing, and one that made me fall in love with solo board gaming. If all this sounds good to you, then I highly recommend you check out Journeys in Middle-earth. Thanks for listening.